Well, thank you so much for coming this morning. It's wonderful to see you all here. I know you probably all had farm chores that you needed to do today, perhaps milk the cows. Like you, young lady, is that what you were supposed to be doing this morning? Or are you already done? You were playing with the cat. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, I have a cat. We have cats in the White House, too. We'll talk about those. Well, good. Good. Well, thank you so much for coming today. You know, this is not my first time in Minnesota. No, not at all. You know, I've been here several times. I used to come here as a child all the time, or not a child, excuse me, as a young man with my brother Elliot, and we would go hunting not too far from here. And, of course, in 1898, you Minnesotans showed your love for me by carving me out of a certain product. Does anyone have an idea of what that might be? I was in full relief because I had just come back from the Spanish-American War out of your favorite product. Come on in. You're good. You're fine. Butter. We're just starting a few minutes early. That's right, butter. And, of course, in 1901, I came back as Vice President of the United States, and you, of course, again carved me out of your favorite product, butter. In 1907, I returned again, and you carved me out of your favorite product, butter. And then in 1911, I came back from safari in Africa, and in this time, you did my carving in a grand way. There was a giant lion, and with my foot up on top of it, and me holding a rifle in full size out of your favorite product, butter. What is it about you Minnesotans and your butter?
This is not cheese.
Not cheese, that's true. Well, that's what they do in Wisconsin, you know. So again, it's been wonderful to be here, to be traveling back through your wonderful state. But you know, I thought we should probably start this story from the very, very beginning. You know, I was small like you at one time. I wasn't as fit and strong standing in front of you as I always was. As a matter of fact, that's where we're going to start the story. I was born in a place called New York City to some very, very wealthy parents. As a matter of fact, the Roosevelts were one of the 7 wealthiest families in all of New York. But that wealth started way, way, way back to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Klaus Marzen van Roosevelt, who came to a place called New Amsterdam from Amsterdam. And when he pulled into this new town that they were just starting, he saw that there was a nice small piece of real estate that he was going to start a farm. So he came from a little bit of money, so he purchased this small 42-acre farm. You know that farm today. It's called Manhattan. He had a pretty good eye for real estate, as you can imagine. And so that when he had purchased that small 42-acre farm, soon people were knocking on his door and asking if they could negotiate a buy to purchase one of their small parcels so they could build a building. Well, he agreed to it. And he was noticing as they were building that number one, a lot of them came and said, I don't have a lot of money. And so he decided, well, maybe I can help out and I can do a loan for you that you can pay it in payments. Pretty smart man. He opened the very first bank in New Amsterdam. And he also noticed that people were building buildings and that they needed hardware. And well, he happened to have some friends back in Amsterdam who were pretty good at designing things like hinges and window frames. And so he started bringing those over by ship and selling them to the people that were building the new buildings. By the time I came along, my father was part of a company called Roosevelt and Sons. And they were importing plate glass for the large, giant skyscrapers that were going up on great-great-grandfather's land. And we had something called plate glass that was being put in all of these skyscrapers. And so Roosevelt and Sons, along with all of our other businesses, were keeping my family very, very busy. Of course, I come along, a little sprite, 1858, just before the Civil War, and my mother is a Southerner from a place called Roswell, Georgia. And in Roswell, my grandmother's family are slave owners. As a matter of fact, my mother had her own slave who slept right next to her, right next to her bed. And of course, my father was a Lincoln Republican. So you can imagine what happened when the Civil War began. That Civil War didn't just happen in the North or the South. It happened in our own dining room just about every night, as my father would scold my mother for her bad behavior. And of course, my grandmother was living with us at this time because we wanted to protect her. And my mother had told my father that she expected him not to fight against her brothers. And was custom of the day for very wealthy families was my father wrote a check, and he sent someone in his stead. I always consider it to be a tarnish on the family name. Never could agree with it. But you know, my mother was right. She should not have my father fighting against her brothers. And so we had someone else take the place. But there was another problem that went on in our family. You see, in spite of the fact that we had wealth, many of us did not have health. My sister Bammy was born with a curvature of her spine, and so she had to have this metal contraction welded to keep her upright. Every time she walked, it would cut into her skin, a terrible, terrible thing. And I myself was born with a terrible disease called asthma. Felt as if I had an elephant standing on my chest. Every time that I tried to grab a breath, I had to fight for every single one. My parents decided that they were going to find out how to cure it. We had wealth, so they brought in the very best physicians that money could buy. The very first physician that put his stethoscope on my chest said, "I'm sorry to inform you, Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, but poor Theodore will not live to be any older than 4. Of course, my parents were very concerned. They decided to find a different doctor. The first doctor came in and he said, "Well, of course, what you're going to need to do any time that young Theodore has an asthma attack, I want you to brew up a large pot of thick black coffee, and I want you to force it down his throat, because as you know, drowsiness causes asthma." Well, of course, if that didn't work, the next cure of the day was asthma cigarettes. Now, my father, because we had good money, decided to go the route with cigars, and so he would light up a very large cigar, and I would smoke the cigar to open my airways. How does that sound for a 4-year-old? Not very good. The final solution was this. If neither the coffee nor the cigarettes or cigars worked, the final solution was a big glass of Kentucky bourbon that I was supposed to drink very quickly to shock my system. If you see photos of me at 4, I look to be the happiest child alive. But you know, my father also had another idea. You see, New York at the time was very, very dirty. Of course, we used coal to heat our buildings, and so we had large smoke that filled the air. And of course, the other problem that we had was that we didn't have automobiles, we had horses. Well, you know what comes out of the backside of a horse. Well, of course, as it came out, it would dry into a fine powder, and as the horses moved along, it would fill the sky. That meant that we couldn't open the windows for me to breathe because there was fine particles of dust. If my windows were opened, I immediately began to cough terribly. So my father had been doing some reading, and what he had found out was in Europe they were doing something called taking the air. And so he decided to test it. One time when I had a terrible attack, he scooped me up into his arms and he walked me down to the carriage house and he hooked up the carriage and he drove me out of the polluted city into the wilderness. And as soon as I got out there, I took a breath. I could breathe. I could feel my small little lungs opening up. And I was seeing all the things that I had been reading about. I never got to go to school as a child. I spent my time in my bed, fighting for air. The only thing I could do was read books, and so I read everything that I could get my hands on. Of course, my favorite were by a gentleman by the name of Mayne Reid. Mayne had written about a young boy who had stowed away on a ship, and he had taken his ship and he had gone around the world, and he was describing his adventures, and he would find things like a dolphin that would swim along the ship, and I would imagine if I ever felt good enough that I was going to be an adventurer, that I was going to be just like that young boy. Well, one day, as my father was out taking me out to the wilderness, as I went along, I found a frog. Oh my goodness, I put the frog in my pocket. And then, my goodness, I found a turtle. Well, I put the turtle in my pocket. And soon, by the time I got home, my pants were wriggling. And I got to my bed and I looked carefully around and I dumped everything out onto my bed. And I began to pull out my books and I began to investigate what they were. Well, then the maids came in and they screamed at all the things bouncing around my room, and my mother had to come in and tell me that I had to get rid of them. And I said, "Mother, I know what I want to do in life. I want to be a naturalist, and I need these for scientific study." My mother didn't care. She said, "Theodore, those need to leave the house." But you know, my father had seen how impressed I was with them, and so he had brought up from the cellar some jars, and I began to put them in jars and preserve them in formaldehyde. And then one day, my mother sent me with my sister to go down to the farmers' markets. Do you still have farmers' markets? You do? Good. Well, good. And our farmers' markets, of course, have the fruits and vegetables, but we also have something else. We have something else called a fishmonger. Young man, what do you think a fishmonger sells?
No clue.
Well, I think the first part was pretty easy. Fish. Fishmonger. So he sells fish. And of course, what he has on his way that he describes his fish or displays his fish is he has cases of ice, and on the top of the ice are the fish. And so I'm walking along with my sister, and I've seen plenty of fish before, but then at the end of his table on a large wooden plank, he had something I had never seen before in my entire life. Well, as soon as I saw it, I began to pull out my rule and my notebook, and I began to sketch it. And I took rudimentary measurements, and I went home, and I looked it up in the book. And what he had was a harbor seal. I'd never seen anything like it. And I remembered in the Main Read book about the young man describing the harbor seals, how the seals would come up in the harbor and they would poke their heads up and they would take a deep breath and they would swim along and follow the ship, and how they would be on the shoreline barking. And I imagined all the adventures that harbor seal had been on, and there was nothing in the world that I wanted worse than to take that rotting, dying seal home. And so I begged the fishmonger to sell it to me. And then I would go home and I would say, Mother, I need to study this fish, this mammal. And she said, Theodore, we do not need a dead, rotting seal in the house. But I would go back day after day after day. And finally one day when I was there, my little 8-year-old heart was broken. It was gone. But you know, that fishmonger knew how important it was to me. So he did the most decent thing an adult could ever do for a person. He cut off his head, and he wrapped it into a bloody towel, and he handed it to me. And it became my most prized possession. Would you like to see it?
No.
Well, we have a couple of people here and one chicken. Phoca vitellina, the harbor seal. Well, of course, I brought the rotten head home, and as soon as I unwrapped it, my mother fainted. And then we boiled it down, and I put a small tag on it and became specimen number 1 in the Theodore Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. Of course, it was in my bedroom. I was only 8, but all the things that I had collected were now saved as a treasure, and I knew exactly what I was going to be. I was going to be a naturalist, which meant that I needed to collect more specimens for my museum. And I also had to beg my father that he had to help me. So he brought in a gentleman by the name of John Bell. John was one of the very best taxidermists in the entire world. And John taught me the art of taxidermy. But what I found out was another thing I needed. These spectacles. I could hear the birds going by. I could mimic them perfectly, but I could never see them. And so I told my father one day, because I was out with some friends at the front stoop, when all of a sudden they began to laugh. And I said, "What are you laughing at?" And they said, "Why, that billboard over there, it's hilarious." And I said, "What billboard?" And my father fit me with these. And as soon as he did, the entire world opened up to me. Soon I could see the birds that I had been mimicking. And my grandfather gave me a small pin shotgun of French manufacture, and soon I was shooting them and collecting them and stuffing them in my rooms. But I still had that asthma. No matter what I did, I had to fight it. And I told my father, I said, "Father, I want to be a naturalist." And he said, "Theodore, you have the mind. You read all the time. But you do not have the body. If you expect to go where your mind can take you, you are going to need to build your body as you did your mind." Well, my father was the most important man to me in my entire life, and whatever he told me, I was going to stick to it. So he purchased for me exercise equipment, and I soon began to build my body. I took up pugilism. You call that boxing these days. I took up wrestling. I was a rower for the Harvard team, and soon I was building my body. And I knew where I was going to go to get my degree in naturalism: Harvard University, where your daughter goes. At Harvard, I showed up, and they took one look at me and said, "What in the heck just happened to Harvard?" You see, at Harvard, you're taught to carry yourself with a certain amount of prestige. You're at one of the very best schools in the entire world. You come from a very wealthy family. Normally, you want to carry your nose up appropriately. And as you're moving along, you move slowly because you're a gentleman. There's no reason to move at a fast pace for a gentleman. Well, of course, this was my first time out of my bedroom cell. And I began to see people like, "Now, Johnson, slow down there!" And I'd be running across Harvard Square. The worst thing you could be was Theodore Roosevelt's friend at Harvard. But you know, I learned a very valuable thing at Harvard. The number one key to success in life is knowing how to get along with people. Soon I began to build friendships, and they decided this funny guy with the high voice and the little spectacles was a pretty decent young man. I was invited to join the boxing club. I was part of the rowing club. I was even part of the very highest one in the entire organization, the Porcelain Society, and it was there one night while I was at a dance when I saw across the room the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen in my life. I was with my friend, and I poked him. I said, "Do you see that girl over there? I will have her. She will not have me, but I will have her." And I began to go over and ask her to dance. What I had seen over there was a young lady by the name of Alice Lee. Alice came from one of the very best Bostonian families. She was one of the most beautiful girls. All the men that were there were all very interested in Alice Lee. And I went up to her and I told her that I was one of the very best dancers at Harvard and I would like to take her out on the dance floor. And she said, no. And then I tried it again. I went back and I said, I'm not kidding you. I am one of the very best dancers in all of Harvard. And after about 30 minutes, she finally decided to go out on the dance floor with me. And what she found out was I was one of the very worst dancers in all of Harvard, but one of the very best convincers. And from being a good convincer, soon she decided there was something about this young Theodore, and we were secretly dating. I decided I was going to ask her to marry me, and just before I was going to do so, my poor father died unexpectedly of cancer. Of course, I was heartbroken. The most important man in my entire life had passed away. But my mother was supportive of the union and told me to go ahead and go for it, and so I decided I was going to ask her to marry me. Decided as well that I was going to have to figure out a way I was going to make a living, because at Harvard what I had learned was this. You see, I wanted to be a naturalist. What I wanted to do was I wanted to observe animals in their natural habitat, to jot down what I had seen, to watch them moving through their environment. At Harvard, the way that you investigated animals is you cut them into the smallest pieces you could and you looked at them through microscopes. I'd spent all of my childhood in bed. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be out in the wilderness to see the animals doing what they do naturally. And so I decided that my next option was going into politics. Well, let me describe it to you this way. It's never easy to tell your family that you want to be a politician. You see, there was this young man who decided he wanted to go into politics. So he did, and he ran, and he was elected at something called a county commissioner. Now, a county commissioner is a person who looks at how roads and such, the infrastructure is going to be built. So he went out and he took everything out for bid. And at the bid, he brought in the man that he thought was most qualified, and they began to build the road. Well, he decided to bring all of his other politician friends together, and they were going to go look at the road and see how things were coming along. So they hired a carriage. And they put all the 20 politicians into the carriage, and they clopped along, and they looked at the road, and they all admired it and said, "My goodness, that man that you hired is doing an excellent job." Well, as they were going along, something spooked the horses. And all of a sudden, the horses broke loose, and the reinman was hanging on for all he could, but the horses were going left, and the horses were going right, and all of a sudden, the horses went around a curve, and as they went around a curve, the carriage skidded, and it crashed into a tree, and all of the politicians fell out. And the horses broke loose, and they went back to town. Well, of course, the horses without the carriage immediately caused a commotion in town, and the sheriff was summoned. The sheriff decided he'd best investigate to see what was going on. Well, he clopped along the roadway, and all of a sudden he came to the crash site, and there were 1,000 pieces of carriage. And in front of this farmer's field were 20 fresh graves. Well, he went and he pounded on the door. He says, "Can you tell me what happened here?" And the farmer says, I can. He says, "Well, what happened?" He says, "Well, I was sitting in my room reading the Bible when all of a sudden I heard a great crash. And I decided I'd best investigate, so I ran out and I saw these 20 bodies laying on the ground, and I decided to do the Christian thing and bury them." And the sheriff said, "Well, were they all dead?" And he said, "Well, a few said they weren't, but you can never trust a politician." You can see what I was up against when I talked to my mother about being in politics. Well, I told her that I thought that it would be important that I become part of the ruling class, and she agreed, and we both decided that probably the best way for me to do that would be to go to law school. Most politicians of my caliber, of my stature in the day, were attorneys. And so I decided to start my law career at Columbia University. Hated it. Most boring thing in the entire world I have ever done has gone into law. And because I was so bored, I decided that what I was going to do was I was going to start writing. It was another passion of mine. So I began to write a book, The Naval War of 1812. You see, my uncles fought for the South in the Navy, and they were very, very skilled. And so I decided to use their knowledge to help me understand what happened at the Naval Battle of 1812. As a matter of fact, the book was so well written that it became a standard expected book on every single ship in the Navy. And now I had an income coming in, and people were very impressed with what I was writing. And I decided that since the Republican Party was talking to me, that maybe I would put my foot into politics, and I ran. Youngest man ever for the city of New York to run. And at 24, I was elected to the New York Assembly. And when I went to New York, they took one look at me and said, "What is this pipsqueak doing here?" They'd never seen anything like me before. As a matter of fact, they described it as this. The Assembly has 126 and a half members. You know who the half was. Well, of course, I immediately stood up and I began my speech. And they found out that there was a little bit of power behind Theodore Roosevelt. You see, there was a judge there that I felt was crooked, and I didn't think we should re-elect him. As a matter of fact, the Republican Party felt very strongly against me, but the news media was soaking up everything I was saying, and soon they were writing about Theodore Roosevelt. And they decided at the Assembly that maybe there was something to this young man. He was kind of a bull in a china shop. And I began to get some respect. I would travel back to New York. By now, we were trying to save money. My beautiful wife was living with my mother. And as often happens as you travel back and forth, soon we are going to have a family. And I decide, before the baby comes, that I'm going to go on a great adventure. And what I'm going for is one of these. Bison. You see, when Mr. Lincoln was president, there were 45 million bison across the United States. 45 million. By the time I went to Medora, Dakota Territory to get my bison, less than 750,000 remained. 45 million to 750,000 in less than 20 years. I was going to Medora, not far from here, to collect my bison because there were 10,000 of them waiting for me, and I wanted to get one before they were all gone. You see, I had a new home being built in Oyster Bay, and I imagined that one of those beautiful bison mounted on the wall would be just the thing. Well, I decided to go to my good friend, Mr. Tiffany, and he made me a knife that commemorated the event. And then I went to my friends, the Colts, and they made a custom gold and silver gun. And, of course, I went to my tailor at Brooks Brothers and had a hunting outfit made. And I got off the train in what you now know as Medora, Dakota Territory to meet the man that I had hired to take me on the hunt. And he took one look at me up and down and said, "I'm not taking you anywhere. You are a New York dude." Well, of course, he was right. I looked as silly as possible. But he had promised me that he was taking me on the hunt. $50 later, we were on our way. As we went along, he told me that he felt he was going to have to babysit me, that I probably didn't know how to ride a horse. 2 hours into it, he was asking when we were going to take a break, and I said, "Isn't this bully fun? Let's keep going." At 4 hours, he said, "Theodore, I think I need to slow down." And I said, "No, my goodness, we haven't even seen a bison. Let's keep moving." By that evening, he said, "I need to go to sleep," and I wanted to continue to talk. By the second day, he needed to get rid of me because I was pooping him out. And what he decided to do was to take me to his friends, the Langs. You see, they had a house there, a ranch, and they were cattle barons, cattle owners. And they soon took a liking to me, and soon they decided that I should use some of the money that I had gotten from my father and invest in the cattle business. Well, I would go back night after night, but we never saw a bison. You see, while we were there, less than 3 weeks before I arrived, all 10,000 head of those bison had been murdered by market hunters. There were no bison left in the Dakotas. I had to ride all the way out to Montana, and I saw what I imagined to be the very last bison on earth, and I set my rifle and I shot him. And I collected his head and I cut it off, and we sent it to St. Paul where it was mounted. Before I left, I had purchased $10,000 worth of cattle in the Dakotas. I got back to my job. I was imagining that this was purely an investment. And I began to work very, very hard. You see, the baby was coming along. Poor Alice was looking like she had swallowed a basketball. And I was working hard to pass all of these laws because I was expecting the baby to come. One day before I was going to travel back, as I was working at a fevered pitch, we got a telegram. "Theodore, you are the proud father of a bouncing baby girl. We patted each other on the backs. We were happy. And then another telegraph arrived, and it said this: Theodore, get home quickly. Alice is dying. Well, I got to the front door. It took me over 7 hours, a trip that normally took 5, because the entire East Coast had been socked in with pea soup fog that entire week. And by the time I got back to my front door, my brother Elliot met me, and he said, Theodore, there is a curse on this house. Alice is dying, and Mother's dying too. I went in, and my poor Alice, she barely recognized me. I held her hand. I tried to give her as much of my Roosevelt strength as I could, but I could see she was fading. And as I was holding her hand, trying to figure out what could be done, the doctor came from upstairs, and as he came down, he collected me, and he said, if you want to say goodbye to your mother, you must do so now. I followed him up the stairs. The clock struck midnight. My poor mother of 47, the shock of gray in her hair, as I held her hand, she died. I went back downstairs, and by now, poor Alice, she was in a coma. She didn't even recognize me. And I held her hand too, and 11 hours later, she died. I lost the 2 most important people in my life on the exact same day. Valentine's Day, 1884. All I could do was open up my diary and put a giant red X in it and say the light has gone out of my life. And then I needed to figure out what I was going to do. I decided to go back and immerse myself in my job. Of course, at Albany, I had all of my friends, and they were working at a fevered pitch just like I had, and so I just increased my work habit. I went from an 18-hour day to a 20-hour day to a 22-hour day, and soon my friends were saying, Theodore, this is not going to work. You are going to burn yourself out, and we don't want to support you. And so they told me, we will not allow you to run again. The only thing that was left for me was my cattle back in the Dakotas. So I packed my bags, I handed my daughter off to my sister Bammy, and I went back to the Dakotas to become a cowboy. I will tell you now, I would never have become president if it were not for my time in the Dakotas. You see, when I was in the Dakotas, what I learned was this. They did not care that I came from a good Harvard education. They did not care that I came from a wealthy family. They certainly did not care that I was a politician. They judged me on my ability to get along with others, on my ability to be honest, to work hard, to pitch in, to be part of what needed to get done. From there, I began to build my body like I'd never built it before. I became lean and strong. I became burnt by the sun. I would go on my hunts, and I would collect animals for my team that we could enjoy and eat, and I could observe. And as I was observing, I decided one day that I was going to write another book, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. People at the East Coast were very concerned about what had happened to me. They were very curious. You see, the funeral that they had attended had been one of the largest in New York history. And what had happened to Theodore Roosevelt? When they began to read the pages, they understood that I had rediscovered myself. And they believed that the book was one of the very best books ever written on natural environment, except for one. The gentleman was a man by the name of George Bird Grinnell. He was an editor of a magazine called Forest and Stream, one of the most popular for the hunting crowd. In his book, or in his magazine, he had written, well, it seems young Roosevelt is a very interesting man. I certainly commend him for rebuilding his life, but he doesn't know a darn thing about deer. Well, when I saw that, I decided it was time for me to go back to New York and punch him in the nose. So I took the train back, and as soon as I got into his office, I was mad. And as I sat down with him, he went page for page through my book, and he described all the things that I had done wrong. We soon became very close friends. As a matter of fact, he had some ideas about how we should preserve animals, how animals should have a certain amount of time where they're hunted, that they're not hunted all the time, that there are times where they need to be breeding, that there are times that are appropriate for harvest, that by doing so we could conserve the animals. And I really enjoyed what he was saying, and so he and I started an organization for hunters called the Boone and Crockett Club, still today one of the most prestigious hunting organizations in the world. And it put in my mind, if I ever was going to run for politics again, which I had no interest in doing, that perhaps I could help preserve our environment. Of course, many things happened. One of those trips, I was back and I fell in love with my childhood sweetheart, a girl by the name of Edith Carew. And Edith and I were secretly engaged, and then we were married, and I needed to have a job. Well, of course, I was invited to do a variety of things. I was a police commissioner. I was a civil service commissioner. I was eventually assistant secretary to the Navy under Mr. McKinley, eventually a soldier. And that's where the story really gets interesting. You see, I was working for as the assistant secretary to the Navy, and we had a battle going on between the Cuban people and the Spanish in a place called Cuba, not far off our coast. And I was very concerned. I told Mr. McKinley, I think we should show the Cuban people that we support them, and he agreed with me, and so I sent one of our ships, the United States Maine, to Cuba, to the Havana harbor, to show the Cuban people that we supported their independence. In the middle of the night, in a cold April night, the ship exploded, and over 200 sailors lost their lives. And I told McKinley, I believe, sir, we are going to war, and if we do, I am going to amend the Roosevelt name, and I am going to go into battle. And he said, you will not, sir. We need you in the Navy, and I have already blocked your commission. There is no possible way you can go. And so as the war tempo came up, as the newspaper said, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine, I was working behind the scenes trying to get myself to become a politician, to a soldier. Well, what happened is when I went to apply, McKinley had blocked my way. So I went to my friends in Congress and I said, you know what, our army's not big enough. If we think we're going to go to Spain, or to Cuba, with our army, we don't have enough people. We're going to need our own people. And I think I know just the friends that we need. My cowboys back in the Dakotas, the men who knew how to ride a horse. We needed a cavalry unit, and we needed the very best people in the entire world. And I knew just the men. So I convinced them that we were going to go. By the time war broke out, we had started something called the United States Volunteer Cavalry. My good friend Leonard Wood was a colonel, and I was lieutenant colonel underneath him. And I was ready to go. We were mustered in a place called San Antonio, Texas. I was sitting at the Menger Hotel signing up more cowboys as they came in to join us. Over 1,200 men were ready to go to battle. As we got the notification, we were told we had 3 days to get to Florida to take the ship out to Cuba. Trains came and we loaded our men and our horses and we began the chug across. Young ladies met us with milk pails and sandwiches. And we were encouraged as we zipped across. Well, we got just outside of Tampa, only 10 miles, and I said, let's stop here and we'll continue to muster. And then when we get the notification, we can very easily take the train down. Well, one night before we were supposed to go, a quartermaster came and, Mr. Roosevelt, if you have the Rough Riders available, they need to be down by the ships by 6 a.m. If they're not there, you will not get to go to battle. Well, of course, we immediately got our men together. We put them on the railroad tracks, waiting for the train to come. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., no train. Finally, at 3:30, another quartermaster comes up and says, Mr. Roosevelt, I'm afraid I gave you the wrong place. You need to be at this railroad track 2 miles away. And we moved our entire group. 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m., I see the train coming, but it's going the wrong direction. And when it comes up to us, I realize that it's a coal train going north. And I stand in front of the train with my pistol and I commandeer it, and we put the men onto the train and we back the train all the way back to Tampa. By the time we get to Tampa, there are 60,000 troops with no idea of where they're supposed to go or what ships they're supposed to be on. I sent Colonel Wood to go find us a ship, and I mustered my men, and we waited for the Yucatan to come in. As soon as they dropped the gangway, I put my men aboard. Everyone was scrambling, trying to figure out how to get on. And I stood at the end with a pistol and said, this is only for the Rough Riders. The rest of you figure out your own ride. And soon we began. We were only halfway out, 45 miles, when all of a sudden we realized that the ship was overloaded, that it could not handle all of the horses and the men. And the only thing we could do was push the horses overboard. By the time we got to Cuba, there were only 4 horses left. My men had no longer been cavalry units. They were now foot soldiers. And as we got there, my 2 horses and Colonel Wood's 2 horses jumped into the water, and mine immediately, one of them drowned. The other one made it to shore, and we began what became, I call, my crowded hour. You see, before we left, I had found out that our Army was planning on giving us all the cast-offs from the Civil War. We were going to be using the smoke-powdered rifles called Springfields, and I couldn't stand to see my men sitting in a spot where they shot a puff of smoke and the enemy knew exactly where they were. And so I purchased with my good friend Mr. Tiffany rifles for all of my men, exactly what the Army was using. And then I found out that they were going to be putting my men in wool uniforms from the Civil War, and I said, my God, man, they'll melt. This is a tropical environment. And so I took the old Indian War shirts, and I had canvas pants and a canvas coat made so that my men were cooler. At the bottom of something called Kettle Hill, up at the top there was a molasses factory wrapped in barbed wire, and there were Spaniards with German machine guns, hydraulic, that were shooting down at us. We were at the bottom with my men cranking Gatling guns. I looked at my poor men, and they were being massacred. And I said, men, we need to go. Follow me. And up the hill we went. By the time we got to the top, I had bullets shooting through me. I had one graze my wrist. I climbed off of my horse, Little Texas, and I cut my way through the barbed wire, and we took that molasses factory, and we cheered, and we looked across, and we saw that San Juan Hill, just the next hill over, was fighting the same battle that we had just done, and we went down our hill, and we went up to San Juan and took that. And then we moved our men to the beaches to wait for the rescue ships to come. And as we were there, my men began to die of yellow fever, scarlet fever, of malaria. And I told the people in Washington, we need to get my men home right away. They're dying. And they said, Roosevelt, you can come whenever you want. You're an officer. And I said, I will not leave my men. And we all left together, and we were quarantined in a place called Long Island, New York. And it was there that the Republican Party came to me and said, Mr. Roosevelt, we need your help. I needed a job, so I was willing to listen. And here's what they told me. You know, our Republican governor has seemed to somehow absconded with $1 million, and we don't believe he's going to get reelected. And I said, I think you do have a problem. And they said, we have a very, very strong Democratic candidate. We need you to run for the Republican ticket. And I said, well, I might be interested. What are the terms? And they said, you do exactly what we say. I said, those aren't very good terms. And they said, if you need a job, they're excellent terms. So I did. I was elected, not by a landslide, by a mere 1,000 votes, and I was now governor of New York. But I had made a promise to the machine that I would do exactly what they told me to do. And when it got to the insurance commissioner, the man that they wanted me to take to have the job was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. And I said, I will not do it. And they decided it was time to get rid of Theodore Roosevelt. And they had an excellent plan. You know, there's one good way to get rid of a politician. If you never want to hear from a politician again, nominate them to be vice president. That was exactly their strategy. They said, Mr. Roosevelt, we believe that you would make an excellent vice president, and McKinley's vice president has passed away, and so we need you to go. Even McKinley came to me and said, Theodore, I think we need you. And so I decided to go to the Republican convention. It was there. The room was filled with Roosevelt signs, Roosevelt for vice president. As a matter of fact, when they gave the call, there was only one dissenting vote. Mine! I knew that if I was vice president, I would never be heard from again. And, of course, you know your history books. We won. And I was relegated to go out and give speeches. I'll tell you how bad it got. I was in a place called Minnesota. Ever heard of it? You see, on the bill at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, it said this. At the Minnesota State Fair, the recreation of Mount Vesuvius. $40,000 in premiums for best livestock. And in very, very fine print, Vice President Roosevelt will be here too. I was there to give a speech, too, that day. And I began with my speech. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the pies. They were delicious. And, of course, for carving my head out of butter. It is delicious, I'm sure. I can't wait to take it home and see the children dig into it. And then I began my speech. I'm sure you're familiar with the African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. That speech would have been lost to history, except 4 days later. Mr. McKinley is in New York at the Pan American Exposition when a man with a bandage wrapped to his hand goes to shake it, and as he does so, he shoots McKinley twice in the stomach. Of course, we were very, very concerned. I immediately checked on McKinley, but he was doing quite well. The comedian Will Rogers of the time said it best. You know, the very best job in the entire world is that of the vice president. All he has to do is wake up every morning and say, "How's the president?" Well, of course, the president wasn't doing very well. And so I checked on him, but he said, "Roosevelt, continue on your way. I'm as fit as a bull moose. Go on, go on." And so I began my speech making. I was up in the Adirondacks giving a speech about conservation when I looked across the valley and I could see the highest hill in all of New York, Mount Marcy. And I decided I was going to climb it and think about what my next stage in life was going to be. As I was looking across that great valley, thinking about being an author or going back to my cattle, a rider came up the hill and said, "Roosevelt, follow me." I could tell by the ashen look on his face that things were not good, and we went down the hill. By the time I got to the bottom, we had heard McKinley had died. We took the train to Buffalo to check his widow, and in there, at a friend's house, I borrowed a top hat and a frock coat, and I was sworn in as the youngest man ever to run our country at 42 years of age. As I stood in that room, I asked the people to support me, sent a letter across the globe telling the people about how awful it was that we had lost such an amazing man, and the cabinet had agreed to stay. And I had told them that I would not change anything. And then I got back to Washington, D.C., and I changed everything. You see, the president is a very important job, but back then it wasn't. I decided it was time to make a little bit of a change. One of the things that we had going on was we had these very large railroad businesses that were all putting themselves together in something called a trust. It was the last thing in the world that it was trustful. And I knew it. J.P. Morgan had come into my office because he was one of the great masterminds of this trust. Your own man, Mr. Hill, was part of it as well. And you see, if they could control how goods and tariffs moved across the country, they could set the price. And I knew this was bad. J.P. Morgan came to my office and he said, "I have no intention of you breaking apart what we're planning to do." And I said, "I have every intention to do." And he said, "You know, Roosevelt, I have some of the very best attorneys money could buy." And I said, "I know you do, and I have 9 very good ones behind me on the hill. Bring them on." We won that battle, and I became known as a trust buster. But you know, there's a lot more in your life that I impacted that you have no idea about. Remember what I told you about my men back in Cuba dying of malaria and scarlet fever? Many of them weren't. They were dying of food poisoning from rancid meat that was packed into cans in the packing plants of Chicago. You see, what had happened is there was a man who had written a book, a man by the name of Upton Sinclair. And Upton Sinclair had described in his book called The Jungle about a group of immigrants had gone to Chicago and they were packing plants and working in the packing plants, and they were falling into the meat grinders and they were being turned into sausage. People were concerned. They said, "President, you need to do something about it." And so I sent a group of men to investigate. Well, the packing plants had gotten news that we were coming, and by the time they got there, they had cleaned up the entire packing plants, except they were just as bad as what Upton Sinclair had written. And so I decided I was going to do something. I created something called the Meat Inspection Act that allowed United States government men to go into packing plants to investigate, to make sure that the meat that was going into your food was safe, that it was properly stamped so that you could eat it. On that exact same day, I also passed another law called the Pure Food and Drug Act. You see, you young ladies were being given all sorts of things to keep you calm. Cocaine, morphine. All of these products that were called miracle cures were instead things that kept you drugged. And I decided that you needed to know what was inside of your products. One product that you use today was even a product that started that way as a patent medicine. Perhaps you've heard of it. Coca-Cola. Coca from the cocaine plant or the coca plant. Not much cocaine, just a tiny amount just to keep you calm. And cola, the cola nut. Of course, it no longer carries that product inside of it. As a matter of fact, they did it even before we passed the law. But that's not what I'm known for, is it? No. It's because of this. This hat. You see, you young ladies. Young lady, can I use you for a minute? Would you be willing to join me? We have a model. What's your name?
Francesca.
Francesca, what a beautiful name. Let's give a hand to Francesca. Francesca is a proper Victorian girl. And because she's a proper Victorian girl, every single day she changes into her 4 different outfits with appropriate hats. So you have a breakfast outfit, you have a lunch outfit, you have a dinner outfit, and then of course you're going dancing in the evening, so you have to have your proper dancing outfit. Now, of course, you'll notice that our hat here has all the appropriate things on it. You have roses, and you have crinoline, and you have these plumes. Young man, can you join me for a moment? What's your name?
Paul.
Paul. Paul is a very enterprising young man. Show them your muscles. I'll help you. There we go. He's a very enterprising young man. And so what Paul has decided to do is that he's going to dig for gold. Gold is selling for $22 an ounce. It's good money. You decide you're going to do that. Is that your brother? What's your brother's name?
Luke.
Luke, stand up, Luke. Luke, on the other hand, is not quite as a hard worker as Paul is. And Luke, one day, as he's in his backyard, glances and sees a bird fly over, and so you shoot that bird. And you decide you're going to sell those flowers to the millinery trade because you don't have just 4 hats, you have 5 days a week. So you have 20 different hats, and so does she, and so does she, and so does she, and so does every woman in the room here is going to have a proper Victorian hat. Because Luke is a pretty good shot, he starts collecting birds that are very, very rare. And this particular bird is the white pelican. Comes from the coast of Florida. As a matter of fact, you are doing such a good job, along with all of your friends, that we are wiping out all of the white pelicans to the point where this bird is now selling for, how much was your gold? $22 an ounce. And Luke is getting $1,000 an ounce for his feathers. This is during a time, Luke, when you can buy a very nice house for $2,000. 2 birds, and you have a house. Very good. Let's have them sit down now. Thank you for your work. So they came to me and they said, Mr. President, if you don't do something, we will have no birds left. And I said, how big a problem is this? And they said, sir, over 9 million birds are being killed a year for ladies' hats. And I said, I don't know what can be done. But my Attorney General said, you know, Mr. President, I found a spot in the past where a president was able to use the strength of his pen through executive order to set aside certain pieces of land that were important. And I said, if that's true, let it be so. And I created the very first wild bird refuge off the coast of Florida, Pelican Island, where those mother birds could raise their young safely and not have to worry about them being decimated. And I would continue to use the strength of that pen to set aside 53 more wildlife refuges, including to protect these, our friend the bison. Because now we've gone from 45 million to 750 to 700. The place that I'm going to put those bison is a place where we still have a few left roaming free. Yellowstone National Park. But I have to go to Congress, and I have to convince them that we need more parks. And I go to Congress. You all know what Congress is, don't you? Congress is a group of people who all discuss things and never get anything done. And of course, you know I'm a progressive president, and the opposite of progress is Congress, so I decide that we are going to pass some laws. Now, we do more than double size of the national parks, but we're still not done. And so I decide to, again, use the strength of my pen. And in 1906, I create something called the Antiquities Act that sets aside national monuments. The very first one that I do is a beautiful piece of pillar out in Wyoming, Devil's Tower. But the one you know me most for is a giant hole in the ground. Some people call it quite grand, the Grand Canyon. But I still wasn't done. You see, there was a young man by the name of Gifford Pinchot. Gifford's family made their fortune in the forestry business. And one day, Gifford's father was looking out, and he glanced across his hillside, and he realized that their entire fortune had been cut down and hauled away. And he turned to his son, and he said, Gifford, we're doing this wrong. If we don't do something about this, there will be no forest left, and our family will be poor. You need to go to Europe and see how they're doing it. So he went to Europe, and what he discovered is that they had created something called the forestry in Europe, but they had planted their trees in perfect rows, as if they were growing corn. And Gifford looked at that and said, that's not a forest. That's not what we need. And he came back with the idea of selectively harvesting within a forest. Instead of taking them all down, just take certain trees and leave the others to grow. And so he came to me with this idea, and I said, you are just the man that I need. And he became my very first head of what I now called the United States Forest Service. By the time I left the presidency, I preserved 230 million acres of land for you and your children and your children's children. Of all the questions that can come before our great nation, short of its preservation in a war, there is none which compares in importance to the great central task of leaving this land even a better land for our descendants than it is for us, for you, for all of us. I went off on safari after my presidency. I ran again and I was elected. As a matter of fact, I was elected because of this little guy. You might recognize him. You see, it all started when I was invited to go on a bear hunt in a place called Mississippi. I was going after one of these, a giant black bear. I was going to put it in the Smithsonian Institute. And I went along with the very best bear hunter in the entire world, a gentleman by the name of Collier. Now, the way that you normally hunt a bear is this. Normally, the bear is out in the woods, and you have a pack of dogs. And you, as the hunter, follow behind. The dogs are barking, and they find the bear, and they flush the bear up into a tree. The hunter shoots the bear, and the bear falls down. But I'm with Mr. Collier. He's the very best bear hunter in the entire world. And what he says to me is, Roosevelt, you stand right here out in the open. My dogs are going to go into the woods. They're going to go bring the bear right in front of you, and all you need to do is shoot it. Well, I did exactly as he said. I stood my ground with my rifle, and I heard the dogs go off. Woof, 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 woof. And soon I heard nothing at all. Well, I stood there for an hour, and then 2, and then 3, and then I got bored, and then I got hungry, and as you can see, I do not miss very many meals. So I decided to go back to the lunch wagon. What do you imagine happened while I was at the lunch wagon? The bear came exactly where Collier had said. He came out of the woods and he poked his head up and he looked around. And then the dogs came out of the woods and they encircled the bear. And then the bear decided that he was going to go back into the woods. And as he started to do so, he began to lunge at the dogs and the dogs began to bite him. Well, Collier saw this and saw that I wasn't around and said, "Where's Roosevelt?" Because he was expecting me to shoot the bear. But of course I was at lunch, so he sent a rider to find me. And then he decided he had to do something because he didn't want the bear to go back into the woods, but he couldn't shoot the bear because he wanted me to do so. So he took the butt end of his rifle and he hit the bear over the head and he knocked him out. And then he took a lasso like this one here. And he tied one end around the bear's head and another end around a tree so that the bear wouldn't get away. And when I rode into camp, what I saw was a poor innocent bear bleeding from the head tied to a tree. And Collier says to me, "President Roosevelt, here's your bear to shoot." Well, I looked at the poor bear and I said, "I will not shoot that bear. That would be unsportsmanlike." Remember, I'm president. Everywhere I go, I have newspaper reporters, and so they're writing the story about how President Roosevelt would not shoot the bear. The story goes around the world, but they need it illustrated, and so they illustrate it with a cartoon. But they don't show a wise old bear. They show a cute little cub bear. Soon I am back in my office in Washington, and I'm getting all these letters about what a fair man I am that I would not shoot that bear. And then I have a box. And I open it up, and inside is a small note pinned to it, and it says, "Dear Mr. Roosevelt, my name is Mr. Mitchum, and I am a manufacturer of small stuffed children's toys. And I would like to name one of my toys after you in honor of your bear hunt." Well, I sent the note back, and I said, "I have no problem with anyone using my name for commerce, but I doubt anyone's going to buy a small stuffed bear named Roosevelt." Of course, what do we call these bears today? Teddy bears. So now you know the teddy bear is named after me, Teddy Roosevelt. In 1904, if you were wearing a pin or a button that had a little teddy bear on it, everyone knew that you were voting for Roosevelt. So after the 1904 election, I was handily elected, and I said that that would serve as my second term. And after that, I was going to go on safari to collect more specimens for the museums around the globe. As a matter of fact, the wealthy men who had opposed me in my entire time all wrote the checks to send me off. It was Carnegie who said it best. As he wrote the check and handed it off, he said, "Let's hope the lions do their job." On safari, when I was there, my hand-picked successor, Mr. Taft, was working very, very hard. And what I realized is that I had left the country in good hands until he began to allow the trusts to take over. And then he fired my head of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. And I had to come back and I had to run again. I went to the Republican convention. By popular vote, I was elected. They wanted me to run as president again. But you see, there was a machine, an electoral machine that blocked my opportunity to do so. And I saw it was rigged, and so I took all of my people out, and we started our own party, the Progressives. They said, "Sir, do you think you're strong enough to run for again?" And I said, "My hat is in the ring, and I am as fit as a bull moose." And soon we had started our own party, the Progressives. We had some pretty impressive platform ideas. One of the things that I believe is that women should be allowed to vote. I believe that you shouldn't have to work 7 days a week. I don't believe that you as a young girl should be working at all. I believe that men should have a 7 or 8 hour work day. I believe that we should have health care for everyone. Of course, it didn't happen. I was in a place called Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was getting out of my hotel. I was just climbing into a car when all of a sudden I heard my name called, and as I turned, a man put his gun to me and he shot me. The bullet ricocheted off my eyeglass case, went doubled through my speech and lodged into my chest. Of course, I'm a big game hunter. I know what a mortal wound looks like, so I spit into my hand and I checked for blood, and the fact that there was no blood told me that I was not going to die, and I said, "Take me to the speech." There were 20,000 people in that auditorium waiting to hear me talk, and as I stepped up to the dais and grabbed on, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you realize it, but I have just been assassinated." Of course, no one could believe me. I had to open up my blouse, and they could see that it was covered with blood, and I began to speak. "I will not die in front of you today because what I have to say is far too important. And besides that, it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose." Well, of course, the crowd went crazy, but my lung was collapsed. I was expected to speak for 90 minutes. At 60 minutes, as I'm holding on, giving my speech, I can feel my voice fading, and I can feel the blood filling my shoes. I began to sway, and they held me up as I continued on. For 22 more minutes, I spoke until they finally said to me, "Mr. Roosevelt, we need to take you to the hospital." I was scheduled to speak for 90 minutes that day, and I only spoke for 82. Of course, you know your history books. We didn't win. But I want you to make a promise to me today. If you ever have an opportunity to hear a politician come and speak in front of you who has just been shot and speaks for 82 minutes, elect them. Of course, I went back to Oyster Bay and I licked my wounds. The Republican Party didn't want anything to do with me. The Democrats were gleeful. They had gotten their man in. And I sat at my chair and I contemplated what my life would be like. I'd been a soldier. I'd been a police commissioner. I'd been an assemblyman. I'd been a vice president. I'd been a governor. I'd been an author. I'd been a cowboy. And I'd been president, all before the age of 43. And as I sat there and I contemplated, I figured something out. All through our lives, we're going to be asked to do things. Sometimes we'll do them well, and sometimes we'll fail. Some people will agree with what we're doing, and some people will disagree with what we're doing. But you know what? It is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again. For there is no effort without error or shortcoming. But he or she who strives to do the deeds, who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends himself to a worthy cause, if in the end they succeed, they know the triumph of high achievement. But if they fail, at least they failed while daring greatly, so that their place is never with those cold and timid souls that knew neither victory nor defeat. The worst we can do in our lives is not to try. The best we can do, if we do it right, they may even put your face on the side of a mountain. Ladies and gentlemen, today, in your generation, the battles continue. What I created continues to erode. The politicians that you have today, would gleefully take away what you have. Remember, the land is your land. It's our land. We are the government, you and I. We make the decisions about what the future should look like for our children and their children. And I encourage you to become active in it because, believe me, every single day they are looking at your participation and saying, if you don't participate, you must not care. There are 640 million acres of land today that have been set aside by the government for we the people. But every single day it's threatened. To give you a statistic that I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit, the United States government has given to the states 156 million acres of land for you, the people. Out of those 156 million acres that used to be owned by the federal government, 111 million acres were sold to private business. This is in your time, not my time. It continues today. You will be most impacted by it because your children will be the ones that want to go see these amazing parks and these amazing monuments. And if they're gone forever. So I'm hoping today that what we get out of this is a couple of things. Roosevelt said this, believe you can and you're halfway there. Believe you can and you're halfway there. It's a very strong statement. The other thing that he said was, do what you can with what you have where you are. So I'm putting it on you today to take away from this the story of my life, but to think about what can you do today where you are. Thank you very much for letting me bend your ear and to have you think a little bit about what our future of our great country looks like. God bless America, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Now I'm going to open it up. We have a few minutes. We have a few minutes for questions. Obviously, there's a lot about Roosevelt that we didn't talk about. So I'm curious what kind of questions you may have. Yes, ma'am.
When did you go on your trip to the Amazon?
To the Amazon. So I was about 55 when I went on that trip. There's a book that you have in the library. It's also on tape. I saw. If you've never read a book about Roosevelt, I highly recommend it as the very first book you ever read. It's called The River of Doubt. The River of Doubt is about a trip down the Amazon that Roosevelt goes on very late in life. It's a fascinating story. I'm not going to ruin it for you. I will tell you that there are headhunters, that there are piranhas in the rivers, that there's malaria, and that Roosevelt himself says, leave me here to die. If that doesn't get you intrigued and want to read it, nothing will. Great question. One of the questions I always get asked that I'm going to bring up here is what people want to know what happened to the daughter. By the time I get to the White House, I have 6 children. My eldest is Alice, who is 17 from my first wife, down to Quentin, who is 2. Alice is the most beautiful girl in Washington, and she knows it. Alice is 17, and Alice, because she is my daughter, likes to break all of the rules. One of the things that Alice likes to do is she likes to smoke cigarettes on the White House lawn, a very bad thing for a Victorian girl. And when I yell at her and tell her not to do so, she goes up to the roof of the White House so that all of Washington can see her. But that's not the worst of Alice. You see, Alice, because she's my daughter, has a pet snake. The pet snake is named Emily Spinach. Emily after her great aunt because, like her aunt, it's very, very thin, and spinach because it is the color green. And Alice carries in her pocket Emily Spinach wherever she goes. So we are at a White House reception when she is meeting people, and she's carefully taking their names. And she finds that one person she does not like, and she notes their name. And then she goes into the White House dining room, and she walks along the White House table because your seats are assigned. There are little place cards. So she goes to the place card of the person, and she takes the cover of her dish, and she lifts it up, and she slides Emily Spinach under the cover and sets it back. And I begin my speech. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here today. I very much appreciate our relationship with the country of France, and I say dinner is served, and the White House staff comes to remove the covers of the plates. And I hear a scream as everyone yells and jumps back, except for one girl who is grinning from ear to ear, my daughter, Alice. Alice got to be a lot of trouble. We were brokering peace between the Russian and the Japanese when all of a sudden she, during dinner, described to the men, all the men that were interested in dating her, that she was going to be jumping into the pool after dinner fully clothed, and any young man in their tuxedo that was interested in her was to do the same. Well, she did just as she promised. She dropped her dessert fork and down through the double doors and splash into the water. And then behind her followed 10 men, 4 of them United States congressmen, 1 who she married. Alice was trouble. I was sitting in my office one day when my best friend was sitting there with me, and Alice broke into the office about something, I don't remember what, and as I kicked her out, my friend Owen Wister turned to me and he said, "Theodore, you must do something about Alice." And I said, "Owen, I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I can't do both." You'll appreciate if you've ever want to read do you have any books on Alice, do you know? Good, excellent. You'll want to check those out. She had a little pillow embroidered that sat next to her on her settee that said this: "If you don't have anything nice to say about anyone, come sit by me." So I always like telling about Alice, and if you've got books on Alice, you definitely need to read about Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Very, very fascinating woman. Any other questions that we have? Yes?
You were a cousin to Eleanor Roosevelt, is that right?
Nope, I was Eleanor Roosevelt's uncle. So Eleanor Roosevelt is my brother Elliot's daughter. Elliot, unfortunately, dies of alcoholism at a young age, and Eleanor's mother also dies at a young age due to some complications of things. And Eleanor and Alice share a common thing. That is, they both go to live with my sister Bammy for a short time. Bammy's a very strong woman. She's the one that I started out in the beginning telling you she lived in this contraption. We called her, as a child, we called her the little adult. She was, from a very young age, a very responsible woman and very strongly opinionated woman, which was great. Not very good in Victorian times. Today, she would be considered an incredible role model. But if you look at the 2 women, both Alice Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, very strong women. And I believe the tie-in that you can find to those is Bammy. So Eleanor falls in love with her cousin, 5th cousin Franklin, and then because both of her parents have passed away, I actually walk Eleanor down the aisle. So I do know Franklin, and as a matter of fact, much of Franklin's work is actually a parallel to what they called Uncle Teddy. So I have something called the Square Deal. What does Franklin have? The New Deal, right? He creates something called the Conservation Corps to put people to work. What are they working on? Conservation. So there's a lot of parallels. Even though Franklin is a Democrat and I am a Republican, there's a lot of parallels that go along with the 2 families. So again, very interesting, and again, it all starts way at the top when Klaus Roosevelt comes to New Amsterdam. So that's where the family starts, at that very beginning. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I was very fortunate. So I work around the country as Theodore Roosevelt. I work for the National Park Service under contract, so I do a lot of work with them. And last summer was the 100th anniversary of our national parks. And one of the places that I was very fortunate to speak, you can see it on C-SPAN, is I was at the Abraham Lincoln Birthplace National Park in Ogdenville, Kentucky. And Theodore Roosevelt laid the cornerstone of the building that the cabin is in. So I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's a very large architectural building. So I gave the speech that he originally gave when he laid the cornerstone. Well, one of the pieces to that is that for their 100th anniversary, they brought in all of the presidents who had spoke or attended something at that park. So another gentleman that showed up was a gentleman who portrays Franklin Roosevelt for Hyde Park. And he and I have become very good friends. And so we're actually writing a play called Roosevelt V Roosevelt, where we're going to be doing the two presidents on a debate format that we'll be doing. We're not sure exactly when it will launch. We're thinking maybe next fall. But yeah, it's kind of fun. So, and he's just the spitting image of Franklin, just wonderful. The best story of them all was he was in his wheelchair for portraying Franklin. And we're in Kentucky in the middle of August. It's 110 degrees in the shade, not literally. And I'm in a full wool suit, and I'm uncomfortable, and Mr. Lincoln is in his full wool suit, and he's uncomfortable. And we get done with the day, and I turn to Franklin, and I say, "I can't wait to sit down." And he just turns to me, and he says, "I can't wait to stand up." So it's great fun. So any other questions before we finish up for the day?
What did you die of?
What did Teddy die of? Good question. So the River of Doubt, you're going to learn some things if you check out that book. You're going to learn that I get malaria in the River of Doubt. It's ultimately a blood clot in the leg that kills me. There's a lot of things that go on after that trip. Quentin, who is really, I mean, remember, he's 2 years old in the White House. He's raised by the news media. He is truly America's child. Quentin is shot down in France during World War I, and that puts Teddy and his wife both into sort of a tailspin. At that point, there were some ideas that he was going to run for president in 1920. He dies in 1919. As Roosevelt himself said, I believe it's better to wear out than rust out. And I think he just wore out. I mean, he was 60 years. He slept. Here's statistics to give you an idea of what kind of a president we had. He slept 4 hours a day. He spoke or read 6 languages. He had a photographic memory, and he read a book a day. He himself wrote over 28 books, which hopefully some of those you have in the library here. He was the first president to ever fly in an airplane. This wasn't the Air Force One that you and I think of. He was in a Curtiss Flyer, and 2 weeks later, the pilot in that plane crashed, and the pilot was killed. He was the very first president to travel underwater in a submarine. He was the very first president to ever own his own automobile, the very first president to ever have a telephone. He won the highest Medal of Honor, the Medal of Honor in the United States for victory in military, and he was the very first American and the very first president to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a man of continual reinvention of firsts, as I shared with you about all the things that he accomplished before 43. He was a human computer. He was an exceptional, exceptional human being. We probably won't have another president like him. Hopefully we do. But I just don't think they don't make him like him anymore. He was just an amazing family and an amazing man. So thank you so much. I'm more than happy to answer questions up here, have my photos taken. If you want to have your picture with a dead president, here's your chance. You won't be the first. But thank you so much for letting me come and bend your ear this morning. Thank you.